All right, approximately a while ago, Mark dropped a little line in a podcast that made Mr. Ryan Muckenhirn and myself, who Ryan is sitting across the table from me for those listening, react in such a manner where we had never heard such a phrase or usage of it before. And MC Ryan can go back and play this little soundbite here real fast.
At what point with these 6.5 bullets do you kind of hit that threshold of like, okay, this is going to be shootable. I can shoot it as much as, relatively speaking, as much as I want, whenever I want. And then you go into something like, hey, this is just a super high-speed bitch cat, and I'm using it for this, and
What
it's...
did he call it?
What?
I don't know if that needs a beep or not.
No, I think we can actually keep... But explain what a bitch cat is.
just like super fast.
Row, row, row. Bitch cat.
Okay, so there you have it. Mark used the term bitch cat.
Yes. Forever changing life as we know it.
It's the truth. I've never heard that before. Ryan had never heard that before. Mark, had you ever heard that before?
Yeah, it was like a common vernacular between like me and my buddies back in the day. A
Interesting.
descriptor of something being fast.
Just incredibly fast,
It's
right?
like when you read those old-timey insults that come from like the Old English.
Okay.
It's one of those things, just vernacular that no longer exists.
Yeah.
Old English.
Until now.
Until now. Well, as we got to talking a little bit after the podcast, and our podcast after the podcast, if you will, we discussed that the name Bitch Cat actually could be perfect for a wildcatted cartridge. And then we got into talk about wildcatting a little bit, and we have heard some people request that we do a podcast on wildcatting because we've done some stuff on reloading in the past. If you haven't checked it out yet, go back and look at our Reloading 101, I think 201 or 102 or something podcast. A lot of information. We even did a podventure all around reloading. It's called Reloading to the Extreme, where Mark and I, first-time reloaders, went and actually tried our hand at it to shoot the Vortex Extreme long-range competition.
And didn't blow up, I might add.
Didn't blow up. Now, speaking of blowing up, though, we're going to take it one step further, and we're not actually going to discuss loading a cartridge that already exists on the mainstream, like the 6.5 Creedmoor, which we did previously. We're actually going to just basically try and invent our own cartridge from sort of scratch, if you will. But, you know, we'll get into how all this works. You'll hear us refer to it as the bitch cat. I think officially our legal guy said, don't call it that.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's perhaps official name will be just BC, which is also pretty cool.
The 6.5 BC.
Can't argue with that.
Slippery.
It does.
Mark has also now revealed the nature of, we're going to try a 6.5, but there's also potential to do a 7 or a 30 cal or a 338 even, who knows. But before we get too far down the road, let's explain. So Ryan, I kind of did a little bit of explanation in this, but go into somewhat of the history around wildcatting, what it is, and even in some of our cartridge 10-minute talks, some of the very mainstream cartridges you see today started out as wildcats. So explain that.
We've dropped the term quite a bit. Wildcatting, I guess there's probably not a Webster's dictionary definition of what wildcatting is, but in the reloading circles, you would make or create a cartridge either from nothing or from something to make something different than what it was before. So here's a couple of good examples that you might know today. 25-06, 270, 280, 280 Ackley, 338-06. These are all commercial cartridges that have been on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Most, if not all, of the Weatherby series cartridges, the 375 H&H, the 416 Rem Mag, 8mm Rem Mag, 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. All of these come from an existing case, are modified to, I guess, achieve or accomplish a goal or task that was not previously possible with the parent case.
Right.
Yes.
And so would you say most of what it goes into is really designing a case, right?
Yeah.
Because in the end, you've got your projectiles, which, does anybody wildcat a projectile?
It has been done. Yeah, not in a long time. But, around the we'll just say the late 40s to maybe late 60s, some sub calibers got big on the scene, like 17, 14, and 12. I think to date, and 20s as well. The 20s and the 17s remain. You can still get them.
What do you mean by sub?
So I guess like non-conventional bore diameters. So
Okay.
yeah, maybe sub bore isn't a good way to describe it. I guess I'm pulling that out of a hat.
It sounds like when you hear subcompact in cars or something, all those things you described sound really small.
Yeah.
Right?
So if I were to say the word sub gauge, we would assume anything under 12 gauge could be considered a sub gauge, like a 20, 28, 32, 410, et cetera.
Yeah.
So these small bore diameters, a really famous one, 17 Remington, which is a modified 223 Rem mag down to 17 caliber.
My buddy Mike was a big fan of the 17 Rem. I shot a coyote
Rem
with his 17 Rem one time. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so I guess that would be like step one of wildcatting. You could take an existing case. Let's actually look at the 204 Ruger. You take a 222 Remington Magnum and you just bring it down to 20 caliber 204 Ruger.
Okay.
So we have an existing case and we just do a simple process in which we reduce or increase the neck diameter to meet a smaller or larger bullet.
Isn't that what they did with the 300 Blackout?
Yep. So
223 case, and they just blasted out the neck to
221 Fireball.
Oh, what the heck?
Well, which is a shortened 222 or 223. So that could be considered like possibly a full-blown Wildcat, where we're taking a case and completely changing its length, body taper, like overall composition and structure in terms of like exterior dimensions, forming it into something new. We wanted something on that case, in this case, the head diameter of a very popular cartridge at the time, shortening it, and then putting a different bullet in it. Well, the 300 AAC or 300 Whisper, 300 Blackout, whatever you want to call it, there's some differences between the Whisper and the 300 AAC. But effectively, we're just opening up the diameter of that case from 223 projectile diameter to 308 projectile diameter.
Gotcha.
And we get the 300 AAC or 300 Whisper, 300 Blackout, whatever you want to call it.
You know, I had forgotten about that, but I remember initially I was hearing about the 300 Whisper, and then all of a sudden all you heard about was the 300 Blackout.
Yeah, yep. So there's some subtle changes that were made, and with that was mostly with respect to neck diameter, like actual neck thickness.
Like the thickness of the physical brass,
Yes.
not the actual gaping hole where the projectile would go.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So the 300 AAC or 300 Blackout was designed that you could just literally cut a 223 case at a particular spot. Didn't matter the thickness of the brass at that point, neck it up, and it would chamber and fire safely in your gun. Whereas the Whisper, you may have to take some consideration to neck thickness, do a neck turn process in order to accept a 30 caliber bullet safely. So slight chamber difference there. If you have a 300 Blackout, you could shoot 300 Whisper ammunition in it, not the inverse, safely.
So the we kind of get, it's a really cool thought to get into wildcatting, because you're thinking of, we're all enthusiasts, and so we all like kind of making things our own, and the idea of calibers is an exciting one, because each different caliber can be used for a different application, or it can be optimized for a certain thing that you want to do with it. We found, though, and this was as we were chatting with Ryan here, as we got into the idea of, okay, we want to do a wildcatting podventure, so in order to do that, we're going to have to wildcat a cartridge. So Mark and I started throwing stuff out at Ryan. We thought to ourselves, we're plunking down, and this is maybe 30 seconds of thinking, right? And we go, okay, I got an idea, Ryan. Why don't we take 375 H&H and neck it down to 6.5? And you were like, already been done. And it's like, okay, well, what if we did like a 30-06, and then we shortened it and we chambered it in 6mm? You're like, already been done. How about we, I got an idea. And we started throwing the book at you. And literally in your encyclopedia of cartridges, you found that pretty much everything we discussed had already been done before.
Yeah, no, that's this.
Right.
That's
right.
that.
I mean, going
that's
to
this. And some of it's like actually popular stuff.
Oh yeah,
that you're like, well, I know that one.
Right, exactly. Like, what was the when you said 338.6?
Yep.
Yeah, I remember saying that one. Like, well, I got a tricky one for you. How about like a 338 ball? Yeah, it's already been done. So trying to actually find something that hasn't been done before is very difficult. That's what we did, and now we're not saying definitively the cartridge that we've developed here has never been done before, because honestly, if you tried to play this game with Ryan, you would think to yourself, literally, basically everything has already been done. So,
it would seem,
but in his large brain and full of different cartridges, it seems as though the one which we'll get into here in a bit that we've kind of stumbled upon here and that really Ryan's done most of the development on hasn't quite been done before in our known world, or at least maybe hasn't blown up to be something really popular, hopefully, unless there's just literally something that somebody's like, I found this at, Cabela's or Walmart. That's what you guys made. That would be embarrassing.
fools.
But, so yeah, I mean, all kinds of people over history have been toying with things. Let's talk about, though, what needs to be considered when you're going to be wildcatting a cartridge. What's step one? I think obviously figuring out what you want to do with it.
Yep.
Yeah, define your need, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Let's define what our need was and what we wanted, and then let's talk about some of the other things that you may want to consider as well. I think, Mark, why don't you get into that?
So, I mean, I guess what I was looking for would be kind of a long range, optimally like a short standard length action, preferably a short action. High stepping, ultra fast, deer stomper.
Yeah.
Deer to elk, deer, black bears, elk, something of that nature, but not wild recoil at the same time. Maybe doesn't use a ton of powder. An efficient cartridge. I think we all know some of the most efficient cartridges out there have a shorter, fatter case design.
Jesus.
And so these are kind of the attributes that I personally found desirable. Now you kind of got to fact check some of the stuff with Ryan to make sure that it's going to work, I guess.
Right.
Which, I mean, let's face it, we need a Ryan to do this project.
Yeah, honestly, Ryan, as you got into, we described our application to you.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as, I guess, when I was saying we'll get into other potential things you go into, I mean, really, that would be a podcast in and of itself, thinking of infinitely many applications you can use a firearm. And so I don't know if we'll really go into that so much, but you heard what we were going for, right? Yep. So as you go through in the catalog of just stuff in your brain that you know about ammunition, what do you start thinking about? I mean, you have to be thinking about, like Mark said, he wants it to try and at least fit in a standard or short action if possible. We want to, obviously, there's rifle considerations, because think about this, folks. If you're going to develop a new cartridge from scratch, you're probably not going to go into just your regular retail sporting goods store and pick out a rifle that's chambered in it. The whole point is that you've sort of made it up.
Yeah.
That is not an option.
So yeah, there's that occurred to me somewhere like on week 3 of talking about this. I thought to myself, how are we going to shoot this thing? With just like a piece of PVC and a hammer and a nail?
Effective, yeah.
It could
work. Hockey mask.
No. Oh yeah, hockey mask. Don't forget that.
Actually, I don't think that could work. I mean, I don't think you could PVC. I don't think would be the optimal.
You're right. Standard water pipe.
Yeah.
I did see some guys make shotguns not far off that description in the Amazon. It was like on a TV show. Anyway,
interesting. So what starts going through your head?
So when you guys had described what the goal was, I guess with the cartridge, it was apparent to me that it was, if we were to look at the smattering of 6.5 options out and about, and we did settle on 6.5 as a bullet diameter pretty quickly.
Yes, because as we know from our 6.5 Revolution podcast, it's very popular. There's so many different projectiles that you can choose from. And if we wanted other people to try and get on board too and start loading up the 6.5 BC, we should just the BC in general, we should probably do a 6.5.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you do 7, no one's going to do it.
The 6.5 is so hot right now.
So hot right now.
And so that was number one.
The 25 really, really hardcore 7 millimeter fans out there right now are just going to
twitching.
They have their voodoo doll of like me right now. They're just stabbing it repeatedly. Sorry.
So 6.5 was kind of the first start. Okay, so we knew that it was going to be that projectile diameter, and then I just kind of assessed the available options for the shooter that were in 6.5, both commercialized and then popular Wildcats. I'm not talking like obscure, extremely out there Wildcats, but like popular Wildcats. And then really, I just kind of ran down the list and I noticed something. On either one side of the spectrum, you're in this hyper efficient case, and I'm going to use like the 6.5 by 47 Lapua as an example.
Okay.
So very like modest powder charge to achieve a particular velocity and do so very consistently and very efficiently. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we had monster cartridges, very large case capacities, large case head diameters, what you would like stereotypically consider as overboard. An example, 6.5 300 Weatherby, hyper velocity rounds that could push hunting weight projectiles at near,
That thing is cooking.
yes, like if you could get the Moonraker laser in rifle format, it would be a 6.5 300 Weatherby or something along those
When
lines.
someone's trying to spot trace, they actually just spot a black hole moving
Correct.
downrange.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was kind of a gap, and by kind of, I mean, it was a very small window to operate in before you were starting to really just get into the same territory as a hyper velocity cartridge, or you would be into this hyper efficient modest cartridge.
Yeah.
So
would you say some of the other hyper velocity ones are something like the AIs, perhaps, or
yeah, some of the AIs or
the,
26 Nosler.
the Noslers,
Yep, stuff like that, where you're using big voluminous cases and you're pushing these projectiles at warp speed.
Yeah.
And so I did ask the question to Mark and Jimmy on whether or not this was a hunting cartridge or if this was a competition shooting cartridge, because I truly believe there is a delineation there.
Yes.
It's not that you couldn't do both with either. One of them is going to be better at the other, or in the respective
Right.
arenas, right? So a 6.5 Creedmoor, for instance, does great double duty, being a very modest cartridge. I wouldn't recommend you take your 6.5 300 out and go start burning down PRS Masters. The barrels are going to get pretty expensive pretty quick.
I was going to say, is the delineation essentially like on the I guess on the competition side, you're looking at barrel life,
Yes.
and so like round count considerations and recoil,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, which we discussed, and by this point in time, and when we're recording, you'll have already had the chance to see our sort of Mark's super high-end custom rifle build versus my sort of more modest PRS competitive long-range build. And we commented that even with 12, 14-pound rifles, we used to kid around at competitive folks who would say, oh, the 6.5 Creedmoor, actually, you got to tame down that recoil. We used to kid around about that, but we found it as you're shooting off these skinny little barricades and you're trying to balance the rifle and have perfect follow-through and see where your shots are going, a lot of this stuff. We did actually find that even with 6.5 Creedmoor, it was just enough that it made follow-through, somewhat difficult from inexperienced competitive shooters here. So, yeah, that is where I'm sure had we had the 6.5 300 Weatherby, then we would have certainly been losing our sight picture when the trigger went off and trying to scramble ourselves back together to see some trace and maybe see a bullet splash or impact. Anyways.
So with that being said, I think what we ended up settling on is more the hunting side.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
This was not designed to be a race gun cartridge. Maybe we'll attack that later, but for the time being, this is a hunting round. If we're going to call a spade, right? So it's a hunting round. We wanted a butt kicking hunting round. And we wanted something different than a lot of the other 6.5 chamberings out there. A little more oomph than your Creedmoor 260 class. A little less throat erosion and reloading and cost of ammunition and recoil than, say, your 26 Nas 6.5 300 Weatherby class. Something in the middle.
Yeah,
Correct.
and not to discount the validity or performance of those cartridges, because they're all extremely great cartridges.
Correct.
We just
Wanted something different.
want something different.
Yep.
There you go, Mark.
So that's what we did.
You've successfully avoided conflict once again.
It's good.
Not that there's
my-
anything wrong with that.
That's my number
Yeah,
one goal in
We'll
life.
throw
Joe.
out. Yeah.
So we identified the caliber that we wanted to use. We had identified the, we'll call it the use case. So it was a hunting round.
Yeah.
And then from there, it was really just picking attributes of case design, of case head diameter, of size, and then rifle requirement that went into the rest.
Yeah. There was a fair amount of rifle requirement that actually went into choosing
Yep.
a lot of this stuff. Because I remember there'd be times where I would just ask you, like, you'd be describing some issue that you were running into, like, well, I want to try and achieve this, but I can't do that. And I'd be like, well, why don't you? We're making this thing custom. Why can't you just, the sky's the limit, right? You just do anything you want. And you were like, do you want to make a custom bolt and a custom, this, that, and the other thing, or do you want to try and use as much as is already out there as possible? And then it was like, oh, okay, so I do see where that reels us in somewhat.
So looking at the case and talking about the application, if somebody like myself, who I would consider an amateur reloader and certainly a novice wildcatter, this will be my first actual real life foray into it.
How long have you been dreaming of this moment?
If my high school CAD CAM and design teacher, Mr. Lundeen, is listening to this, you may recall my 10th, 11th, and 12th grade CAD CAM and design projects in which I did cartridge renditions in those respective applications, and then we turned them out of Delrin. That's as close as I had ever gotten. This is fruition, if you will.
I'm not sure you're allowed to design cartridges in schools these days.
I had some really good instructors, Mr. Lundeen, Mr. Gould, good guys. A lot of artistic freedom.
You'd be surprised. I remember seeing some of the machine shop kind of classes and stuff. I think that you just get a different style of instructor.
Yeah. And these,
well, that makes me feel good.
And that is really where it
Take
started.
shop class, kids.
Truly. That's where it started. I started reloading fairly seriously. I would say probably when I was 16, when I could drive to the store and buy components. I had been reloading before that, but got into it when I was about that age. And so it kind of went hand in hand, and that's where it did start, where I thought, hey, I wonder if there's a better mousetrap, and then looked at concept and design and existing products that were out there, and figured out how to kind of mesh them and mold them to fit a very particular application. And then, this is kind of coming full circle on it. So backing up again, the rifle limitations were something that was very real. And so we'll speak to case design a little bit. It's not that you couldn't go out and make your own case, like from scratch. We're talking unique case head diameter, primer pocket depth, primer pocket diameter, primer style, shape. Take, for example, you look at a 280 Ackley and you look at a 300 Weatherby. These have two very unique shoulder profiles, where the Ackley is an extremely steep 40-degree shoulder. I mean, it looks like a diamond cut, like a very faceted case. Whereas a 300 Weatherby and all of the other Weatherby cartridges, save for the new 6.5 RPM, have a radius shoulder, which is very unusual from cartridge design.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so instead of having a steep angle, they've got this radius shoulder. So there's nothing that says you can't do that kind of thing. That you couldn't come up with a unique case diameter. But the limitations then become much greater, because you are then going to start into a unique rifle system. We wanted something basement reloader, like what I am. So you could go buy an off-the-shelf rifle, pull the barrel, do a custom chambering, utilize a platform that's already existent, say a Remington 700, a Tikka T3, a Winchester Model 70, plug in a new barrel, and go to town.
Gotcha.
And so that's where we settled on at least the case head diameter, and then the cartridge overall length to adhere to a cartridge overall length, or a box magazine restriction, or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So nothing crazy, wild, out there, unique, unobtainium as far as bolt head diameter and bolt face and all that goes. So that part is fairly standard with respect to the design.
Can we discuss? We even have talked about, because we were discussing with our legal guy here. Well, let's say the 6.5 BC catches on, this, that, and the other thing. Do we have some sort of? Should we try and make it ours? And Ryan, you were describing how you make it basically a 1/10 of a millimeter longer in the neck, and it's a completely unique design. And you're not going to sue somebody over doing that. Whatever. So anyway, we're going to give you guys, I think, some of the information on what we did. So can we say what head diameter, what bolt were we trying to match up to in this case, or what cartridge do we start?
What's the parent case?
At the very base of the rifle.
Parent case could be described as 300 Remington Ultra Mag or Ultra Mag Basic.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So large diameter case head, not outer space diameter, large diameter, but it is a big case head. It's one of the largest bolt faces that you can get in a commercial rifle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and as we know, bigger is better.
Right, Mark.
Yeah.
So you did that
Yep.
in order to try and effectively get as much, I'm guessing, capacity in the case via diameter rather than length.
Correct. Exactly.
Right? Okay, so if you, in theory, have a bigger diameter of your case, you don't necessarily need to go quite as long in order to have so much powder in there. Now, where did you go from there? You're sort of like, okay, so we have the 300 rum
Yep.
that we can kind of start with. Obviously, there's plenty of rifles out there chambered in 300 rum. So we can start with that. The bolt will still work, right? So if we got, which we did, we got like a Remington 700, right?
Yep.
And
Correct.
300 rum.
Yep.
So anyway, that bolt will still work. We don't have to switch that out. Now what?
So then it was determining case length and profile. And so I'm not gonna describe the entirety of the process because it was somewhat arduous and it's a very apples to oranges comparison. Effectively, and there are a lot of rum-based cartridges out there, or that at least share that bolt face. The length on this one is unique from tearing through pretty much everything I can find. This is going to sound really goofy, and people are going to be like, "This guy is crazy." I took a ratio of length between several other cartridges that accomplish similar things, and to skip ahead slightly, this comes down to cartridge overall length, case capacity, and bullet seat to depth.
Okay.
These were the three things that I took into consideration when designing this. So I looked at another rum-based case in a similar caliber and compared it to two cases that are very similar, not rum-based, and a dimensional change that occurred while still maintaining cartridge overall length, so with the bullet seated, like the cartridge loaded, and
of a typical 300 rum or something?
No,
so you could use its magazines?
That one was two smaller cases that were wildly successful, both of them in their own right, but contrast. So 260 and 6.5 Creedmoor.
Yes.
And then, so I kind of made a correlation or a comparison between those two and applied it to that 300 rum parent case, shorten it up. And then I also used a shorter case that Mark really likes, the 300 Winchester Short Magnum, and then compared its length against the rum, ran a bunch of pocket calculator comparisons between them and kind of settled on something in the middle. At the end of the day, my goal was with a heavyweight 4 caliber projectile, not to exceed a cartridge overall length that is similar or same as that as, say, a 300 Win Mag, without seating the bullet deeply into the case and chewing into the powder capacity, which is where the 6.5 Creedmoor 260 thing comes in.
And then to get into that a little bit, I know we've discussed it in our reloading and some of our other podcasts. In order to add weight to said projectile, so you have 6.5, you can't make a 6.5 bigger than 6.5 or else it won't go down the barrel. So the only way to add weight is to make it longer physically. Yep. So if you want a heavier bullet, it's going to be longer, and either, Ryan, I don't know if it's actually an either. Maybe it's just there's only one way to do it. But either you seat it out a little bit further, or you seat it in at the normal depth, but then it's going to eat into the powder capacity in the case beneath it.
Correct.
So you wanted to make sure that we could use heavier bullets, and I assume that's because... Is it heavier bullet just generally more ideal for hunting scenarios? I know some people sometimes you got those like monolithic bullets that are actually lighter, but they're longer. I see. That's where like when people say like, oh, I wanted to shoot a heavier projectile. Why?
Let's speak to hunting bullets, right? And we'll get into long range projectiles too, but for like a hunting bullet,
hopefully I didn't throw you off.
No, not at all. So a heavier weight projectile, like if we're shooting a 308 or a 30-06 and you shoot a 150 grain bullet or a 180 grain bullet, more weight is, depending on bullet construction, potentially going to, 1, increase your energy on target, and 2, increase the penetration capabilities of the projectile if all things were considered the same. So if we were shooting a 150 grain nozzler partition and a 180 grain nozzler partition, the 180, carrying more mass, has the ability to potentially penetrate deeper through heavier hide and bone.
Like if somebody threw a marble at you versus somebody throwing a bowling ball at you.
Exactly. Okay. Yep. If we could keep the marble and the bowling ball the same diameter.
God.
Like wiffle ball versus a baseball.
Yes.
Yeah, that's probably a better comparison.
Right. So with that, like Jim had touched on, if you add weight, you add length, and if you add length, you eat into case capacity or you seat a bullet out longer. So I'm going to circle back to the 260 6.5 Creedmoor comparison, and this is one that we touched on in the 6.5 Revolution podcast, where the 260, and I'm going to use the word failed, and I don't.
Oh boy!
Where it did not enjoy the commercial success.
Well, you heard it here. I think Ryan Muckenhirn is anti-AR-15, and he also hates the 260.
Actually, I've had 4 260s. So where it did not enjoy the commercial success of the 6.5 Creedmoor was with respect to its cartridge overall length and the velocity it could generate with a particular weight of projectile.
What was it about the overall length that was maybe a detractor?
So if you loaded it with a bullet longer than what factory length came,
okay,
you would not be able to load it in an SR-25 magazine or an M110 magazine. So in a bolt gun, great. Who
big
cares?
deal.
If you did load it at that case length or that overall length requirement to fit in that SR-25 magazine or M110 magazine, you would really cut into its performance. Where the 6.5 Creedmoor really pulled away is they looked at what was being eaten up in the case, changed a body taper profile and a shoulder profile, shortened the case, and put more of the bullet outside of it while still maintaining the same overall length. So we can load it then in that SR-25 magazine and more often than not exceed the performance that the 260 could with comparable weight bullets in that same cartridge overall length.
I understand it now.
Yeah.
I finally do.
So
makes sense.
Right. So it was
Ryan's
really
also not anti-AR-15. I'm gonna throw that out there.
No.
It was a funny joke from a previous podcast. That was gonna weigh on my brain if that was out there.
Yeah, people are like dousing their torches right now.
Right. Yeah. Put out your torches.
So really that was case optimization. Like there was something existent and they're like, well, we could probably make it better by doing kind of a nip tuck situation and then a relocation of the bullet and then optimizing the available case space. And that was the secret sauce. And that's actually what happened here with the 6.5 BC that we see in front of us. It was an optimization of case volume without exceeding cartridge overall length.
Right. When you say cartridge overall length, did I ask this before? What cartridge is that in comparison to?
So I used like a 300 Win Mag or similar cartridges at their C2 depths, 3.340.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it.
So
Okay.
with that cartridge overall length, which a lot of those cases are going to fall into, going longer than that can complicate your feeding, your ability to load a repeater within that magazine. That has kind of become a spec in that class of cartridge, 3.340.
And so you play around with stuff like you said this part was convoluted a little bit trying to get into, and you kind of ripped out a calculator and stuff like this. But
yeah,
we've talked about this before in podcasts, but like changing the shoulder angle and the neck length.
Yes.
It seems like that shoulder angle kind of can keep the bullet out or in the powder capacity down in the case below it.
Yep.
And the neck length can also kind of somewhat do that.
So the big considerations made there, I'm an Ackley shooter. I've got a 280 Ackley, and I've loaded for some other Ackley cartridges. A big fan of the concept. One thing that they were plagued with early on in their infancy, most of this has been corrected, is feeding. So the cartridges are very square. Like if you were to look at them from a cross section without a bullet, they've got some very sharp angles on them.
Okay. And when you see a round chamber, it kind of has this little loop, this ramp to go up.
Yep. So there's kind of a happy in between there. It's not quite full Ackley, but it's not the gentle slope shoulder that you would find on something like a 270 or a 30-06 or a 308.
Okay, right.
It's an in-betwixt shoulder angle. And so we again looked at an existent case that fed well, that was a large, like a high capacity, high performing case, and effectively cut it off at the shoulder and then use that shoulder profile moving it up. The neck length kind of comes from, I guess, something my hunting partner told me about bullet diameters and neck lengths and how he won't pick a cartridge that has a bullet diameter equal to or greater than its neck length. Because it messes with his head. And so
Personal
So
thing.
I adhered to that too. And then I did measure a whole bunch of other cartridges' neck lengths relative to their bullet diameters. And there's not like a blueprint that this has to follow because it varies greatly. But I did want a neck that was going to provide adequate support and tension. And then provide an opportunity if we were shooting a bullet that had a very long boat tail, like the one that you have in front of you, to have adequate neck purchase and tension on the bullet without having to seat that long bolt tail profile so deep into the case. And then if we switch to a flat base bullet, not leave the bullet hanging out on his toenails.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay,
Gotcha.
that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Now, you kind of came up with all this stuff, and that was all fine and dandy, right? But at some point in time, you can't just sort of have everything drawn up on a napkin and shove the napkin into a rifle, right?
Right.
I mean, that doesn't. You have to have something sort of physically get made, right?
Yes.
So, what are these steps that somebody who, they've gone through, they've number punched, they've had a bunch of drawings, they've went through all the manuals, and they kind of have this design that they want to do. Where are they going now? What tools are they going to need? Who are they going to need to contact that's going to have to help them make this a reality? I know that we contacted a few various different people from, it seems like machinists. We have obviously a brass case in front of us. This is there powder in this?
No.
Oh, right. There's no primer in it. This is what it would look like loaded. So we actually have a physical sample here, even though we haven't actually started loading up 6.5 BCs yet.
Well, and looking at, the drawings, right? The drawings that we have to create this, they definitely aren't written on a napkin.
No napkins.
Weren't they to start?
They were. It was 8.5 by 11,
Oh, it was
like a
medium
medium weight. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Initially,
Got it.
but I'm saying step 2.
Yeah.
Kind of what you're talking about, the next evolution of that.
Yeah, we worked with the engineers for a little bit. They threw some stuff into some 3D CAD. We got to see it and drew over it for a bit. And we had the luxury of having it 3D printed at first to see what it would look like.
Which at that point, then it was very real. When you could hold, as close to a real example in your hand as possible. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. But yeah, so we started in a program called Solidworks, which is a really popular modeling software, and took the dimensions that we had sketched out on paper and put them into like real print form. And then, there's some things that go into consideration, like do these dimensions actually line up? Is there going to be an error here? Is there going to be an error there? So we put it into modeled form, did a 3D print, and then took those prints and then got them over to a reamer producer. And so the reamer is effectively, if you were to cross-section your rifle's barrel, you would have, of course, your bore, you would see your lands and grooves, and then the chamber component, like the place that the cartridge physically sits in upon firing. Your chamber is cut with a very special tool, effectively a drill bit, with a mirror image of the external dimensions of the case that cuts into your barrel. So if you bought a barrel blank, you would have just a solid piece of steel with a hole in it, the bore diameter with the rifling already input and cut into it.
Jim and I can picture this exactly because we actually watched this process happen live in the custom versus
in the custom
basic.
guns building, right? Go back and check out that YouTube video when we were at Isaiah's shop, Curtis Custom Weapons. You got to see what a reamer was doing in the chambering process. But okay, so it is kind of like a drill, but like you said, it mirrors the shape of essentially sort of this part, like the top half of your cartridge, right?
Correct, yep.
So you kind of get that idea, and that's how the bullet's going to seat in there. And then, obviously, the reamer has to be long enough in order for it to be able to go in and drill out a long enough channel for your cartridge to sit in.
Correct. So we had some reamers made to reflect the various calibers and of course, the one you see here. From there, we went to a custom brass producer. So this is the part where it can either be pretty simple or pretty convoluted. So we did a unique case length, case shape. And so we started with a case head that was known, case body that was known, unique shoulder profile, unique length. So we weren't able to take existent brass very easily anyways and shape it into this.
Okay.
We are able to do that now that we know what it is going to be, what it's going to turn out. We could make this out of 300 Remington Ultramag brass if we wanted to, but we wanted to start fresh. So we We went to a custom brass producer. We got them the prints. We got them the reamer dimensions that they used, and they made us custom brass appropriately sized and shaped exactly correct to our dimensional drawings.
That's awesome.
It is incredible.
And then you would go and send that to...
So from here, then we need to go into die production because again, this is not a cataloged item. You can't just buy these dies from your local reloading shop. So you work with a die maker using those dimensional drawings and reamers and prints. And in our case, we actually have sample cases, and they produce the reloading die to load the cartridges, to reshape them after firing, to seat the bullets in them, and all that.
Yep.
So it's very much so we made the tools, or rather we had somebody make the tools to our specifications, and then we are making the tools to reload the things that we made to our specifications.
Yes. But yeah, quite a process though. And one of the things, again, that going into this, I never even considered is, when this cartridge does get developed, yeah, indeed you do need to have somebody be able to help you produce these things by giving you the tools necessary, which I think in my mind is a really cool concept because when people think about tools, you've got wrenches. Let's just throw wrenches out there, for example. You've got 6mm wrenches, 10mm wrenches, 20mm wrenches, whatever you got, quarter, 3/8, all that stuff. These are all tools that are kind of made to fit in with everything that already exists, right? And then when you have to go to somebody and actually have them make you a tool to make a very specific thing just for you, I think that's pretty cool to me. Like custom tools. I really enjoy that.
And that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So the reamer, a custom tool to chamber the gun, the dies, a custom tool to reload the cases.
Right.
And
I just
from scratch. It was cool.
It also makes me think about, okay, the people who made our custom tools had to have tools to make the custom tools. Mm-hmm. In order to make the custom tool making tools, they needed to have tools to make the custom tool making tools. Mm-hmm. But what tools made the custom tool making tools? And then what was the original tool that at some point in there we had an industrial revolution, right?
Yes.
And all these factories started coming out of nowhere, and you have all these machines and all this stuff. Okay, well, somebody had to make like the first machine. And did they make it from just a hammer and a chisel? I don't know.
I think so.
Was the 6.5 BC the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution? We don't know.
That's true.
It could have been, or the ultimate culmination.
We've come full circle.
That one always trips me out, though.
You're twisting my mind up.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
what was the original tool?
It is pretty interesting when
chicken or the egg. Classic chicken or the egg, Jim.
When you look at the reamer and you hold it in your hand, and it's unique. It's never been shaped that way, profiled that way, shouldered that way.
Yeah,
and it's cut to do this, which is bonkers.
Yeah,
a lot of wonderment. This
it is pretty neat. And when you hold it in your hand, for those of you looking, that's a 6.5 BC.
That's the real deal. And so for getting let's talk about the rifle again here. Mm-hmm. For getting the barrel set up to go for us, we're going to have to probably go to a gunsmith and have them essentially chamber our barrel.
Yep.
Are we just going to get a blank barrel? So like we said, we went the route where we're trying to make this for your basement reloader.
Yes.
Your basement Wildcatter. The basement Wildcatter might go the route we went, using some existent stuff for, where you can use a bolt that already exists, all that. So we went out and we got a Remington 700 on sale at one of our local retailers, and it happened to be chambered in 300 round. Mm-hmm. Now, when we take that barrel off and put a new one on, what are we going to do? Are we going to go, can you go with a Remage barrel that we can, or are we going to go with just some regular old?
So we're gonna do a full gunsmith fit barrel, and we talked about the Remage option, but because the cartridge doesn't exist and we haven't had a chance to monkey with it, rather than go that route off the bat, we're gonna go with a full gunsmith fit.
Okay.
So we're gonna take a 6.5 blank. We haven't settled on contour yet, but I know you guys are gonna hunt with this, so it's probably not gonna be the full weight. Yeah.
No.
We'll go with something in a medium.
Oh, wait, I was suggesting varmint.
What?
Oh, I'm just kidding.
Oh.
We might have to make two.
We're going to go with a medium weight, fairly long, between 24 and 26 inch barrel. It's going to be twisted between 1 7.5 and 1 8. And then we're going to have the reamer cut, of course, the chamber into that barrel, and then that barrel is going to be fit to the action. So it'll be a full, like this is if you were to do a complete and total rebarrel, and we're shouldering the barrel up against the action, whereas the Remage version uses a barrel nut or a collet type nut to control the head space on the barrel.
Yeah.
This is actually going to shoulder up right against the face of the receiver.
Okay.
So we'll have that plunge and cut and fitted, and then start the load development process.
That'll be pretty interesting to see all occur. I'm also
Yeah.
very nervous,
Yeah.
but it will be cool to be a part of.
Yeah.
I was about to say watch, but I can't bear to just stand by and watch that. But I gotta
Nervous, excited.
Yeah.
nervous, excited.
Yeah.
What was I going to ask too about the barrel? Oh, this is kind of an offshoot random question, but it just occurred to me as we've been. This has been, as many of these pod ventures have hopefully been entertaining and educational for you listeners out there. It's been enlightening for me as well. Hopefully you too, Mark. But
Oh, absolutely.
as you see this barrel blank that comes in, like you said, it just comes in where it's just a pipe with a bore diameter hole drilled right through the middle of it with all your lands and grooves. And then you go in with this tool and you cut out some of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you pick a barrel length, let's say 24-inch barrel, that's not 24 inches of area that your bullet won't actually be traveling 24 inches down the barrel. Will
No.
because if you're thinking about like behind you have some of these examples of super long, big old cartridges, right? Those actually eat up a fair amount of their barrel in just literally the cartridge just sticking in there. Right?
So you could attack that a couple different ways. You could go with a term called finish length. So your barrel as measured from the receiver to the end of the muzzle is 24 inches.
Okay.
Or you could attack it with usable barrel length, which is pretty uncommon. I don't know a lot of folks that use the usable barrel length method when determining their barrel length.
Yeah.
So that would be the measurement from the case mouth when chambered to the end of the muzzle. And I don't have a good reason why you would or wouldn't do that. I guess convention states that we go with finished barrel length because we're still looking at the rifle's overall length.
And when you talk about legalities and stuff too, they talk about finished barrel length.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yep. So you wouldn't look at an SBR and if somebody was like, well, that's not the correct barrel length, you go, but wait, is it usable barrel length or finished barrel length? They're going on the finished barrel length.
Yep.
So that's what we'll do too. Like I said, somewhere between 24 and 26.
Does that have anything to do with when you try and choose the barrel length that I guess you said not many people think about finished barrel length, but does it ever make sense to where you're like, well, I want to make sure that it, the bullet is part of this many lands and grooves and hits this many
So with
rotations.
usable barrel length, with finished barrel length, like that's what you would end up 24 or 26. It's going to be in there. With the usable barrel length, I'm not going to put too much precedent on that because I actually don't know how this cartridge is going to perform in real life. I have some speculation on how it's going to perform based on its case capacity in water, and just some other similar cartridges plus or minus it on the size scale. So I have an idea where it's going to be.
And then as part of that barrel length consideration, how you anticipate the powder burn going as well?
Partially, yes.
Okay.
Where it gets a little interesting, though, with respect to barrel length, and it's not the end-all, do-all, because you could load a rifle cartridge for a rifle with a shorter barrel to meet or exceed what you would expect a longer barrel to produce, depending on how your throat is cut or what kind of powders you're using, how much powder you're using.
Okay.
And then you can have examples where you have a longer barreled rifle, which conventionally we would assume shoots faster than a shorter barrel rifle, actually does the inverse. I had two rifles, same chambering, everything. The same loads fired through both rifles, shot very well, shot remarkably different velocities. My shorter barrel was chambered, we'll just say tighter than the longer barrel, and actually outpaced the longer barrel by a margin.
Huh.
Yeah. And so that comes down to how the chambering was set up, how the throat, how the bullet interacted with lands and grooves, where it started to develop pressure. It was different between those two chamberings.
Yeah.
And so one produced different numbers than the other. I think, again, without overcomplicating it and without searching for, single-digit feet per second here and there, if we look at cartridges like this in this class, typically we find them running between 24 and 26-inch barrels because somebody's already done that homework, and that's kind of the in the fashion way to do things, that's where we'll end up.
Yeah.
Somewhere between 24 and 26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we go back to tools here for a second? Let's go to tools here for a second. So otherwise, other than the custom tooling that we need, like dies and the reamer and all that stuff, what tools would one need? Just any tools that like most reloaders would have?
Yeah.
Or, okay, so obviously in this case, custom brass, super nice to have. If you're going to make your own.
Sure.
From something that exists. I've heard of people do fire forming and then they'll do stuff to the to the case. I've heard, people just get a case and they don't fire form it and then they start doing stuff to it, right?
Yep.
So if you're going to be doing that route, what kind of tools should you have that, again, are they most the same ones most reloaders have, or are there some additional ones to like cut and form and do all this? That
Great question. So because we went the custom case route and we actually had the brass produced, we are going to skip some, we'll call them intermediate to advanced steps. If we were going to start with parent case and make this case, we would need the ability to shorten the case. We would need the ability to resize the case, and we would need the ability to handle some of the dimensions like neck thickness, for instance. So some other tools that we would need if we went the parent case down route, something to cut the case. There's a few different ways to do this. You wouldn't necessarily have to cut it. You could use a sizing die, and you'd probably want to use a stepped sizing die. So we would be going from, say, 300 rum down to effectively the 7mm variant of this, effectively to the 6.5 variant of this. We would then trim the neck length back to reflect the correct case overall length.
Okay.
And then we would turn the neck. So we would need a neck turning tool and pilot kit to do that.
Because you described to me that oftentimes the thickness of the brass up in the neck is not the same as the thickness of the brass down in the body of the case.
So
usually it's thicker in the body of the case.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
If we were to do the 300 rum parent case down, we would absolutely, unless we set the chambering up, which we did discuss, kind of that 300 AAC versus 300 whisper thing, we set this up to have like finished neck thickness, right? We wanted it at a particular thickness, and that's what we settled on. If we didn't do that, we could either turn the necks, which is an additional step, which starts to monkey with your consistencies, and then you've got to start playing with bushing dies, make sure you get the proper neck tension, or we could just go with finished neck length. So if we were not doing that, if we didn't go with this custom case, we'd need a neck turning tool, pilots. We would probably need to look at bushing dies so that we could control the neck tension and help determine what is going to be the optimal neck thickness and tension. And then we would need likely another die to help get that original cartridge down to the correct size. Because otherwise we're going to be exerting a lot of force onto the case to try to reshape it and resize it, because we're taking quite a bit of brass and we're moving it through something. And if you go too much at one time, you end up with misshapen cases. You can crush a case. You can stick a case in a die, which is a disaster. We didn't want to do that. So will the possibility be there to make this case as we see it in front of us now from existent 300 rum brass? Absolutely. It will take some additional steps. We skipped it. We went with a custom brass manufacturer.
Cool.
Which ultimately was not that unreasonable. If you look at the investment in like what those other tools would cost to do, and the amount of time that it would take to execute those steps, and then the amount of like checks and balances to go in to ensure that you've got a quality product at the end of it, it probably does break even or close to. With respect to custom brass production. And considering this is something that doesn't exist in conventional sense, it was a logical route.
Is there an overall structural advantage, I guess I'll describe it, with going this way? Like, is this going to be a case that you could reload maybe like more times versus going the other route?
So with this custom brass producer, this is very unique brass.
It's like billet.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So conventional rifle brass, as you see it, if you go down and visit an ammunition production plant, usually starts with sheets of brass or slugs of brass that are then punched and formed. So you could also call them drawn, right? So they start very thick and short and end up very long and thin.
Okay, yeah.
And there are zero things wrong with conventional brass production. 99.99% of the brass that we shoot out of our rifles, reload out of our rifles from new brass, that is how that brass is made. This is a major departure from that, in that this is turned brass from stock.
It's crazy.
It is.
To think about the tooling needed.
Yeah.
Ugh.
So this started life as a solid piece of brass rod, and then is shaped down to this. And the company that we utilize did not go so deep into the proprietary nature of how they do this. What they did tell me, though, is the means of manufacture here allow the shooter and reloader to potentially get away with less powder than what one would expect in a case this size with this H2O capacity. Because the case walls are thicker.
I was going to say, there's only one way to do that, and that's a thicker case wall.
And then the inside of the case is a non-conventional shape. So if we cross-section a case, like a conventional rifle brass, this drawn style, and you look at how the inside is shaped, say at the junction of like the case head and the body, the web, and you look at that, usually you've got a fairly square compartment. This does not have that. This has a very round compartment. It's almost like a rounded cylinder on the inside. The case wall thickness is remarkably heavier. On paper, when you look at the H2O capacity, it's alarming because it's not much compared to other cartridges its size. And initially I was off put by that because I thought we were going to have something rather anemic considering its size.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're diminishing the powder capacity.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. The other part that goes into that is optimization of internal case capacity. Now, this speaks to a whole level of nerd that I cannot even try to achieve, no matter how much book reading I do. And in speaking with the team over there, basically they've discovered a way to make rifle brass with respect to its interior dimensions, utilize less powder, achieve same or even slightly higher pressures safely, to propel projectiles at high velocity.
I gotta say it. This thing got a Hemi.
Yes, it does actually. In fact, have a hemispherical component
Mm-hmm.
on the inside.
Something about that Hemi. That's pretty cool.
What's crazy about this brass, when you hold it unloaded in your hand, just the case, it is
Right.
notably heavier.
Oh, I can tell when I picked that up because that's why I asked you if there's powder in
Yeah.
there. 'Cause
Exactly.
It feels heavy enough to have powder in it.
Yeah.
This feels like a loaded cartridge. There's not even
There's
not a
no
primer in it.
powder.
There's no primer.
And just the unloaded brass outweighs in the hand what you would expect a case that size.
It's
to
literally
weigh.
like it's just like high compression.
Yeah.
And that's what it is.
Yeah.
It is interesting to me, and every time I hear, and I'm no metallurgist or anything, but when I hear about having this turned brass, and I hear about the process that most new brass goes through, there does seem to be. I always wonder what goes into like, okay, so this is sort of like billet, right? You machine out any imperfections or grains or anything like that in that metal are still there. Whereas when you go through a drawing or a forging or something like that process, you sort of can, this is where my terminology completely breaks down, but you basically like pound in the grains or the imperfections. They all become super compressed together. And oftentimes something that's forged or made through some sort of I'll say forceful process rather than machined out of a nice relaxed block of metal, it can be stronger.
Yes.
And so, but I suppose then when your walls are thicker with something like this, it probably balances out and you get something that's probably just as strong.
So I beg that question too.
Yeah.
So to speak to me not liking ARs, which is not true. I worked for an AR manufacturer before I worked here at Vortex. And the debate between billet and forging was one that was rampant. People often associated a higher degree of quality to a billet product over a forged.
Right.
Where if we start polling the metallurgists in the crowd, the metallurgists will say, well, to Jim's point exactly, through the forging process, you actually get a potentially stronger component. That's not to say a billet product is going to be weaker because there's ways to tweak this.
Okay.
And so when I begged that question, I started talking about stress relief. I started talking about hardness. They assured me that the alloy that they're using, this is not like yellow brass. This is
Ain't your daddy's brass.
yeah. Pretty much that's what he said.
Okay.
This is a completely different brass alloy that stands up to what we're trying to do without having to worry about work hardening, which is a problem with conventionally drawn brass. So if you reload it enough times, you kind of
Gets brittle.
Yep,
Right.
correct. You work harden that brass. You have to anneal it to bring it back to a malleable form so that it doesn't snap and crack. And that's where this kind of came full circle. And he's like, eventually you would have to anneal this brass if you were to do enough reloadings and firings on it. Initially, you won't for a longer period of time.
That's cool.
So again, we're probably saving equipment steps and costs. Further advantage, machine turn brass.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Mark and I are going to have, hopefully at the end of this podventure, a little bit of a payoff episode here, an adventure with this cartridge. Not only we're going to go through the adventure of trying to load it up, but we're also going to go on our first hunt, just happens to be the way the timing's going to work out, an antelope hunt.
Yeah.
And stay tuned for more on that. But I'm wondering, to Ryan, what projectile are we going to be using primarily out of this? And again, obviously knowing that it's primarily for hunting. What powder are we going to be using as well? Like, what are you thinking?
I'm going to take some stabs.
Yeah.
I'm going to say projectile can be anything from 120 grain Hornady GMX, 127 grain Barnes LRX, excuse me.
Those are really lightweight bullets, though.
They are, but they're magic bullets.
Oh, boy.
I'm crazy about these homogeneous bullet designs.
You are.
And their effectiveness on game.
So I'm picturing this cartridge with a 120 grain bullet.
Mhm.
That's going to be like lightning.
It is. We can overcome ballistic coefficient advantages with velocity to a point.
We can just overcome Earth's environment.
Yeah.
Just gravity and other forces.
I would say if we're going to match the projectile to the quarry, there's no reason to shoot 127 grain Barnes LRX at a pronghorn antelope. I do every year because I like the way the bullets work, and they're extremely effective. But that's probably over bulleting our quarry.
As far as like how like tough of a bullet that
Correct.
is, you mean?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. If you were going to hunt elk or large-bodied deer with a 6.5 caliber,
Mhm.
that would be a bullet I would push you towards,
Which one now?
like a Barnes LRX.
Okay.
Yep. So a very heavy construction, excellent penetration properties, massive weight retention.
Yeah.
I shot a deer last year with a Barnes TTSX, so the non-long range version of that bullet. That bullet lost 1 grain of weight after about 30 inches of penetration, several
impressive.
ribs,
Unbelievable.
several vertebrae. Effectively, it lost its nose cone, and that was the end of it.
I think the reason why I brought up why those are the ones that you suggested are such lightweight bullets isn't because I'm worried it's not going to take down an antelope. It was more just because the point of this was to get a heavier bullet, right?
True.
And be able to shoot it without taking up a bunch of powder capacity. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm giving you a little bit of crap because it's like, well, the whole point,
So bullet weight doesn't necessarily mean effectiveness
okay.
with respect to hunting. In my experience or opinion, you could have a very heavyweight bullet that was an extraordinarily high BC bullet, and at a given range, it'll act like a hand grenade when it goes off.
Right.
You could get very poor penetration. You could have, I guess you could categorize it as catastrophic bullet failure. If we're pushing a bullet that's not constructed properly but is weighted heavy at a velocity that's too high. As we extend the distance and we get into like long range,
Yeah.
that heavyweight bullet with its very high BC could pull away, will likely pull away over these lighter weight bullets with lower BCs in terms of drop, in terms of wind deflection. And then their lighter jacket constructions will actually aid in like the ability to, kill that animal. At a longer range, thinner jacket bullets will have the ability to expand more reliably than a heavy jacket or a homogeneous bullet design.
Okay, yeah.
And so there will be some give and take here. Picking a bullet, that's a very long conversation. It's a huge argument. I get in with myself every year. I don't shoot game at very long ranges. I pretty much set my maximum effective range at the minimum velocity threshold for a bullet to expand reliably.
I think that's the tricky part too. I mean, you are looking for that magic bullet. You look at this cartridge, as it sits right now, untested, right? We haven't loaded it, but you're like, oh man, I want this to be the perfect hunting round, but I want it to perform optimally from point blank to 600, 700, 800 yards, right? And finding that bullet that does it all, a little bit tricky.
If I'm going to pick 3, I'm going to look at the Swift Sirocco 2.
Ooh.
I'm going to look at the Nosler Accubon Long Range.
That's the one that I was looking at.
And I'm going to look at the Sierra Game Changer.
Wait, this is for long range?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
The Game Changer. Is that?
Imagine the Game King with a high BC, fancy high-speed nose.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, the Game Changer.
Sounds
It's
interesting.
a bullet that's not talked about a lot.
No.
I've heard it before, but I think I heard about it from you.
Okay.
I've shot 165 regular Accubons out of my 300 short. It did exceptionally well. I've shot the 180 Swift Siroccos out of my 30-06. I really liked those as well. So it'd be interesting to see kind of how the variants, I guess, of those in this do. But I really like both those.
It's so amazing, bullets, I mean, you just think to yourself, you're like, well, it's a rock headed at this thing at, hundreds, thousands feet per second. How does it not just hit it and just kersplat, like whatever it is,
That's how I ended up reloading.
send it down.
Yep.
But there is all this.
And sometimes they do.
Yeah.
And sometimes they do. Sometimes, people just shoot whatever bullet they got and it puts it down, right? I mean, it's one of those things where it seems it's impossible to ever know for sure what's going to happen between a bullet and said animal's skeletal and flesh structure.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, okay. So we have an idea of the bullet we're going to be running. Now, when I asked the bullet we're going to be running, did you say that because you knew we were going for antelope and you would switch it up if we were going to go for, say, elk?
If you were going to hunt elk with it, I would still be pretty confident in all 3 of those selections. Personally, I would elect...
reasonable or when I say reasonable for us, I mean, because everybody has their own idea. But
if I was going to hunt something as large as elk, and I don't hunt elk, so maybe I can't even speak to this, I would be shooting something like the Barnes, personally.
Cool.
I've had the opportunity to push enough lead and copper through game animals that I've just grown very enamored with their effectiveness at the ranges which I hunt. So those, knowing that I may have the opportunity to, or should I say, I have the need to break down skeletal structure, I know those bullets do it. That's what I would personally run.
Cool.
Back on powder, it's a big case. Big cases a lot of times benefit from running
blue dot.
No.
Okay.
There's a funny story on that though. Big cases a lot of times benefit from running slow burning powders, magnum powders. Think Reloader 26, H1000, IMR 7828, IMR 7828 super shortcut. That's going to be the fun part, is finding out what works well.
Okay.
And to that same point, I've also loaded Varget in 375 H&H, 300 Weatherby, 300 Win Mag. So that is up in the air. It's really going to come down to what shoots the best and most consistently. At this point in the development game, I'm not going to be chasing velocity, even though the potential for velocity is certainly there with the cartridge. I think we're going to...
Ryan.
Didn't we covered more is better earlier?
I think we're going to get there. But you got to walk before you run.
I suppose this is where, you want to kind of dip your toe in the water before you jump in, sort of thing.
Quit playing around, blow that thing up as heavy as it'll go.
So with some of these powders that I've talked about, I know in cases like this, similar to this, capacities and structure and that kind of thing, those powders are very likely going to pull away and put up big numbers.
Cool.
And do so accurately and consistently across varying temperature swings, which is another thing that I'm personally fanatical about.
Temperature swings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. So
very important.
We've got this wonderful indoor range here at Vortex that's always kept at a certain temperature and humidity that does not accurately reflect what it's like in Cody, Wyoming, or in Taos, New Mexico, or
Yeah.
So you need a powder that's going to remain resilient and consistent across a variety of temperature swings.
I mean, that could be, freezing to
Yep.
80 degrees.
Yep.
Sub-zero.
We're going to need a temperature chamber in the range.
There is a fridge down there.
Perfect.
And freezer.
Even more perfect.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, thinking about that, and now I'm like totally sidetracking, but thinking of extreme temperatures. You and I were on that Missouri deer hunt a few years back, and we were neg 25 with the wind chill.
Oh, yeah, the one where you had to keep your rangefinders in your armpits.
No, we were muzzleloader hunting,
Yeah.
but I'd be curious like how that was affecting.
I'm certain it did.
Yeah.
Yeah. The lower you go in temperature, the crazier things get. And then, of course, the higher you go in temperature, the crazier things get, too. There's like a sweet spot for most of those powders. The powder that we happen to both be shooting on that from my research and then my use and application has proven very consistent across a variety of temperature swings. But that is a big consideration. You can get some really interesting numbers out of a given cartridge or a case using a powder. But if its temp stability isn't there, I sometimes question its validity in the field. So if I'm doing
certainly.
Yeah. If I'm doing load development in July in Wisconsin, where we can have temperatures approaching 100 degrees, and I'm getting these bonkers numbers over my chronograph, without running into pressure signs, what does that look like at 32 degrees Fahrenheit? If I'm 70 degrees cooler, potentially.
How does a person test for that, though? You put it in the freezer, put it in the fridge,
You
then shoot
can.
it?
Yeah, you can do that. Or you chrono your loads at those temperatures. You let that ammunition acclimate, so don't take it out of your warm truck, throw it in the gun on a 32-degree day and be like, oh, well, it's the same. You let the ammunition acclimate to it, and then you shoot it over the chronograph. And you will be surprised at your results.
And you got to wait 6 months, though, for it to get either hot or cold.
We can play with the freezer. We can see what it does.
I think that's what we need.
Yeah. And it's also, for those thinking about getting into reloading and wildcatting, don't start your load development at 32 degrees Fahrenheit and be like, oh, okay, I'm safe. I don't exhibit pressure signs and my velocity is very modest. Because depending on your powder, depending on your case, depending on your chambering, if you increase that temperature 40, 50 degrees, now all of a sudden you can have extremely unsafe pressures.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, there's some balances to be struck here. So be careful. We'll start modest. I plan on finding a case within known load data of similar capacity, reducing that by 10%, and then working my way up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, there's some known entities that we can model off of, but this is definitely unique.
Very uncharted territory.
We say we put a pin in this one and we'll pick up on the next episode.
Bam.
All right, everybody. You heard it here. The bitch cat, or BC, according to our legal guy, and you never heard us say bitch cat on here.
No.
If he asks, is officially happening. So you guys are going to get to follow along, and hopefully this inspires you. As Ryan actually just kind of pointed out, though, please don't blow yourselves up. Doing any of this stuff. Please exercise safety and talk to some, pros and experts. I want to say ask us, but I also don't want to put us on the line for anything that might happen. So just remember all of this that you potentially do. If you're empowered to go and wildcat your own cartridge, do so at your own risk. And if anybody asks, your good old friends at Vortex Nation Podcast didn't ever tell you anything.
No.
So, yes, it's all on your own volition. But anyway, stay tuned. Next episode, I'm sure we'll get into more of this powder stuff and some experimentation with our cartridge. So thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.